In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Bungubox Silent Night. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a much darker blue-black than is my preference. Much darker. In fact, I really see it as just black. Now, it's perfectly good as a black, but as blue-black, I'm really disappointed. It only shades every now and then, showing the tiniest little bit of blue if you manage to get a lighter area on the page. I also noticed a general spreading of the width of the line from every pen I used it in, and that in order to get a really thin line, if that's what you really need a drier writing fine or extra fine pen, which is not something I run to. Unfortunately, I have a bottle of this, and that's because I really was interested in the new bottle and I got suckered by that. Now, I'm going to use it up and I'm going to enjoy this ink while I'm using it, but I'm going to treat it like a black ink, not a blue-black ink. That leaves me a bit disappointed with this ink. Not sad over it, but just a little disappointed. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today, that pen is a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather and no spread for this. We get no shading, but we are experiencing a good, consistent black tone. And with no real shading, that's good with a black ink. Unfortunately, as I said, this is blue-black. But we can act like it's black and just do pretend. Now, a medium has no feathering, but it is a little broader than you would expect from a Japanese fine, which is what I'm writing with. So it does have some spread. It has no shading whatsoever. It is a good, solid black line the whole way through. So if that's what you want, that's what you get. On that double broad, we get no feathering. We get a tiny bit of spread, but it is a double broad after all. We get zero shading, good solid black tone. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very little ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Kaweco brass sport with a fine nib, a Pilot E95S with a medium nib, a Pelican M205 the Duo highlighter with a double broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather and no spread. A good fine writer here. Now, this is one of the only dry fines that I have, and that's why it's maintaining this line width. It's otherwise good performance. We're getting no shading, a solid black line out of this blue black ink. I'm not letting that go. It is very nice there. It's holding up fairly well. It doesn't look as dark as it did on the Clairfontaine, and I don't know if that is a reaction with the paper or my eyeball for this paper having some tone to it. The medium is quite a bit darker than the fine. The medium has no feathering, but a bit of spread going on. Zero shading, which for those that like that, that's great. The double broad is darker than the medium with no feathering. Yes, plenty of spread. That's the paper just sucking this ink up. No shading whatsoever. Looking at the back of the page, there were a few spots that I'm surprised it didn't touch the page underneath, but it did not bleed. And of course, we get some ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading whatsoever. The same, I want to call it a muted black. It's a solid, well performing black, but it is just a little more muted than we saw on the Clairefontaine. Very nice here. I do really like it a lot. The medium is darker than the fine. It has no feather, tiny bit of spread, no shading whatsoever, solid black that looks beautiful as a black. Now, the double broad has a couple tiny feathers that are occurring, and we haven't really experienced that much here. Right in the loop of the D of difference, you see a couple tiny feathers going on there. In the W of between, a couple tiny feathers, but nothing too bad. No shading whatsoever. Looking at the back of the page, this performed better than the Leuchtterm. It does have ghosting, but it has much less bleed into the page than the Leuchtterm had. I'm really starting to think that Leuchtterm and Moleskine might have swapped papers. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, good solid black line all the way, and that would be awesome if this was a black ink, but it's blue black. So it's not awesome. Unless it's black, then it's awesome. The medium is darker than the fine, with no feather, a little bit of spread, no shading whatsoever. I do think these are coming across very well on this paper and performing exceptionally well. I would feel good using this ink on this paper without any problems. And the double broad is darker than the medium, much darker than the medium. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It's just like writing with a marker with a double broad, but it's doing very well here. This paper really should be looked at by people more, and because it's not a premium brand, it kind of gets ignored. And when people look at cheap paper, they only ever want to know about the copy paper. Now, looking at the back of the page, we do get some ghosting. It's not too bad, especially with the fine. We get no bleed through because this paper performs very well. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Pennsylvania Railroad Boiler Steam Blue Black. Here is Califolio Olifants. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Blue Black. Here is Parker Quink Permanent Blue Black. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, no shading. This is doing very well. It's got a good solid black tone all the way through the writing. The medium is a bit darker than the fine with no feather, some spread. The spread is not as bad as I've seen on some of the other papers. It's doing better here than it did on the Leuchtterm or the Moleskine. No shading whatsoever. It's really stand out great at this point. Now, when we get to the double broad, we have some feathering that's going on. In the second line, in the word source, there's a lot of feathering that comes up. And then in the third line of prestige, we get some feathering. But this is an incredibly wet, double broad nib putting ink down on this paper, so we expect a lot of bad things. And those bad things are going to leave you disappointed. When you see the back of the page, you get a normal amount of ghosting, but it does not bleed through and touch the page underneath. So it is doing very well. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here's a green shimmering ink by Diamine, their Golden Oasis. Here is a red shimmering ink by Diamine, their Red Luster. Here is a magenta ink by Private Reserve, their Claret. Here is a shimmering pink ink by Pen BBS, their number 140. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get some feathering. You see it on the 3 of the 1535. You see it on the Farius in the name. You see it on Challenged. There's a little bit of feathering, but actually I think it's holding it together really well here. There's a tiny bit of spread, but doing better than this has done on some other papers when you talk about spread and you think about how it did with those medium nibs. No shading whatsoever. Now, the medium has a lot of tiny feathers all the way through the strutter. So, all of that feathering is a little distracting to me, but it is cheap paper. There is naturally going to be some spread, and we do get it. We get no shading whatsoever. Double broad, yes, we get feathering. Yes, we get spread. No, I'm not surprised by it. That was fully expected, and it delivered. Really, what more can you expect on that? I did stupidity there. Looking at the next page, you see I circled the spots where it did create dots underneath, but these aren't huge dots. If I didn't circle them, you probably wouldn't even see them on camera. Looking at the back of the page where the writing is, you have a normal amount of show through, and the bleed is not horrible, but it does touch the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? It almost always gives a solid black line, which is a shame. But then became a dealer's choice because of that. It's a very solid performer if it's a black ink. Now, if you do want it to be thinner, then use that dry fine, kind of like my Kaweco Brass Sport. It works very well in that. So I can see using that ink in this pen frequently for that. But for me, for general use, I would prefer to get a good darker black the whole way through and from a wet medium pen, maybe a very wet fine, just because I know about that in general spread that this ink has. Thanks for watching.